Mr. Pat's back.
Morning, Pat.
Good morning. You've been missed.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we're
Although I've seen you've taken a leaf from Leader's book and gone to Substack.
Yeah, Substack is becoming the place.
It is. It is. It must be all those Germans that can't get it in a tweet.
Yeah.
But I've also noticed some, I don't know whether it's Substack or whether it was Medium or even both, but some people are electing to put their headers in black print on the screen. But the actual text, the actual body text, is all in a mid-grey, which makes it really difficult to read, especially when you've got bright sunshine.
Mm.
It looks awful.
Huh. I haven't noticed that.
Including a couple of people on regenerative cities that are coming up via stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. It's been, I read recently that, I mean, I had sort of been aware of Substack as a kind of a place that, you know, dissident journalists were going, you know, like Taibbi and Aaron Mate and that sort of thing. But recently I've actually been running into people in higher ed sort of talking about it and, you know, and thinking about, well, is this going to be a medium that we're going to, you know, that we're going to be able to use to sort of distribute content to learners, if not actual sort of university students. I noticed also that Nick is teaching an extension course at UCLA.
There is it? Curious.
Yeah, I can hear you now, Chris.
Yeah.
Goody.
Which I say, you know, I mean, I'm happy for him. More power to him. Although I think it's a little funny that he thinks this is the first time that anyone's ever taught note taking at a university.
Now that you can highlight paragraphs and restack is what they call it,
Mm-hmm.
and or highlight them as though they're notes, and therefore make those notes public, at least within the Substack platform. We end up, of course, chatting there too.
Yeah, and we have a couple times.
So it's clearly a place to put the bigger post that wouldn't necessarily go down in Facebook.
Right.
That one,
Yeah.
and get it talked about.
Yeah, I guess it's been years since I've really since I've participated in Facebook. I had it many years ago, but yeah, it's been and Twitter. It did kind of seem like, I mean, I would always drop something in Twitter, you know, announcing that I had, you know, dropped a video or whatever. But it just, you know, it's like a drop in the ocean. And I do think that that maybe, you know, I haven't really I don't think I completely understand what is going on with notes and chat and, you know, and how we're going to end up using them each. And the whole restacking thing seems kind of.
At the moment, every time I restack something, I also copy the restack as a highlight to class. And then anything I make as a comment, at the moment, I'm also copying to classes comment. section.
Uh-huh.
At the moment, I haven't bothered to look to see if I can lift everything, a bit like Readwise does from the Kindle,
Right.
out of Substack,
Yeah.
that I've said about all your bits, or others as well.
Uh-huh.
As and when I find that out, or there is a API connection or something, and I can stop doing it twice. But the universes of Substack and the universes of Class are tiny compared to sort of Twitter or Facebook, as you say, dropping an ocean.
Yeah.
The part of the conversation I don't hear anyone having, and that was had when a lot of people moved to Mastodon, was what's going to make this different than Medium, than Tumblr, than LinkedIn or Twitter, which all have had problems in one way, shape, or form or another. What's going to protect me, the user, or me, the teacher, and the students who I forced to use this as a tool to prevent the same things that have happened in the past happening again and again? Because you're just getting back on the merry-go-round and you're just waiting for that thing to happen again. Now, in Substack's case, it's nice that there's a slightly different business model that allows the writer to make some money. But I find for the average person, and Substack did a really good job essentially early on of, they fronted the money for a lot of writers to make it easy for Matt Taibbi to leave where he was at and come to the platform and immediately have a salary.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to protect you and give you, here's a chunk of seed money for you to show up here and build something with no downside. You're going to have money on day one. But they're not doing that when Dan Alasso shows up and saying, Dan, we really need you here. You're a valuable part of the community. And, you're not as big a name as Taibbi, so we're only going to give you like 10 grand, maybe, let's say, instead of 100,
right,
to be here and do this.
Right.
And but they did that for early big name users.
Well, and as you mentioned, yeah, they did it for Heather.
Easy to bankroll Stephen King. Right. People are going to follow.
Right.
But the issue is the network effect. They know as soon as they get the Stephen Kings of the world and the big name writers, the audience will follow. And then once the audience is there, who cares all the rest? Yeah. So I don't see people on their engineering team or their PR team talking about user safety controls, big ability to block or switch things. Mm-hmm. And communities are always nice and lovely and cute and pretty when it's 10,000 or even 100,000 people. But once you get to Twitter scale or Facebook scale, right, all that goes out the window, and it's much, much harder to bolt that stuff on after the fact. And, that we're just, in fact, I heard somebody the other day, one of my daughter laughed because she was watching a TikTok of someone speaking in Spanish and they didn't know the word for carousel. So they invented a word for carousel in Spanish that essentially was a direct translation of horse tornado. And so when I say you're getting back onto the carousel for another spin around the block,
yeah,
realize that you're getting onto the horse tornado. It hasn't reached speed yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and you mentioned you commented on one of my posts, and you mentioned that you suspected sort of that, because I had been talking about my previous my former colleague, my former dissertation. She was my dissertation chair for a while, Heather Cox Richardson, and yeah, I suspect you're probably right. She probably did get some type of a deal because she was. She had demonstrated an interest and a capacity to bring readers to blogs. And then she had sort of transitioned. We had had this thing. She had been president of it. She didn't start it, but it was called the Historical Society, and it was out of Boston University originally. And she was president of it, and they kind of fancied themselves a regular academic group, right? They had conferences, every year or two, and that sort of thing. And they ran this blog, and I, when I was a grad student, I became a frequent contributor. I think I was the second most frequent contributor after Heather herself, and then it kind of blew up. I got kind of annoyed and lost my temper actually with them, because they were it was very class oriented. You were not a different, you were different if you were a grad student. I was one of the only grad students. It was a bunch of kind of mid-career faculty who were not all of them at R1s or anything, but had sort of all come through that elite training of people who end up teaching at R1s, so I said once they gave me editorial privileges, I abused them, and and so it all blew up, and that was at about the same time that they were actually circling the drain as well. And so so that blew up, it ended, and then she went off and she started doing she would do Facebook Lives, and she would have like hundreds of thousands of people just watching her, kind of sitting in front of this shelf of all old, expensive, kind of first edition books, and and leather bound beautiful volumes, and and she would just talk, but very much kind of in a sort of a wine mommy kind of way, that she was, and that's I guess that's sort of my criticism of her now too, is that it's very, it's very much, there is an element that I agree with, of sort of, using the past to understand the present, right? And talking about historical events and historical people and historical movements and, all that, especially in US history, and how it kind of brings us to, the present situation and helps to explain it. In the case of what she's doing, I think it's just way too much about sort of, blue team good, red team bad kind of stuff. And I think that is huge for her readership. I think that it gives her, it's sort of like Robert Reich, right? It gives her it gives her readership ammunition, right, to support the things that they already understand as kind of the talking points and the party line and the concerns of their team. And so Wright gives, sort of pseudo economic, rationales, and she gives sort of pseudo historical ones. It's hugely successful. I mean, she has millions of subscribers and probably hundreds of thousands of paid subscribers, which, when you start adding up those numbers, I don't know why she bothers to continue working at BC.
And she's everywhere. I get her email blog, and it's quite long, and it's every single day.
Yes.
I mean, how does she have time to? She must type very, very fast. And then I listen to her podcast now and then. So that takes a lot of time. It's amazing what she cranks out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is she still active? Is Now and Then still active? It seemed like it had gone on
a
hiatus. Okay. Yeah. I mean, she's super prolific. She actually, her ex-husband was a corporate lawyer. And so when I took a writing seminar with her at UMass, and she said, we worry so much, we think so much about how difficult and precious writing is. She says, corporate lawyers turn out briefs on the regular, and they can be hundreds of thousands of words long. And I was like, well, yeah, and they're also hundreds, large percentage of those hundreds of thousands of words is kind of boilerplate. But she had a point. There are people who for whom it's just work. It's just it's a thing they do. Yeah.
Well, how much of it is repetitive too versus new stuff? So there's but let's say a Trump indictment comes out. That's never happened before, so there's not a whole lot of historical precedent to draw upon. So sit down and look at what she has written about that in the last 2 days and see how much of that overlaps with, the same repetitive rhetoric of past versions.
Mm-hmm.
And is she really rewriting everything new, or, does she have usually once you're at the level she's at and you've got those talking points down, it's easy to repeat them, even if you're typing them out afresh.
Right.
Or if you're like us and you have a card index and you can just kind of tip it out a little bit, that's even easier, because then you're just cutting and pasting a few examples. And, as long as you're keeping track of what you've tipped out recently and you wait a month or two, your readership, because there are probably people who read her every day, but then there's a bunch of people who probably more likely dip in and out for bits and pieces. And the reason, Dan, she doesn't leave the university, that's 80% of her platform.
Yeah.
Without that platform, she's now got Substack as a separate thing, but if you put all your eggs in Substack and a year from now Substack goes under or has a problem and everybody leaves,
right,
all your eyeballs leave with it. And
yes.
then suddenly you as an author are stuck holding the bag.
I agree. I agree with that. I think, I think that it would be unwise for her to leave. But I do still find it kind of interesting that, because when I was her grad student, she and I would have conversations about publishing, right? Because she was very, she had her first book, Greatest Nation of the Earth, I think, which had been her dissertation. So it was sort of her remix of the dissertation, I think, came out through the Harvard Press. She went straight through. She did her undergraduate straight through her PhD at Harvard. And then I think her next book was a Yale book. And then, ultimately she made the transition to, I think it's Basic, I think is her publisher now. So she, and she was telling us, and at the time, it was just, it had been true for her. And I think it was, and she wasn't, and she was telling us in good faith, but I think it was at the very last moment in which it was true that, this was a sort of a repeatable trajectory, and that you could, expect generally, advances would double every time, every book, especially as you're transitioning into the commercial world. And she really is a good, she's the model of that trajectory. And she's done, at the same time. And so she's done a lot. She's built up a very big, sort of public platform, in addition to, retaining. And I think Chris, probably the thing that it really does for, staying at Boston College is that it solidifies her claim to, the passing of the Foner mantle. Foner was the, sort of the American political historian of the, of the Civil War and Reconstruction era. And now, he's kind of retiring or winding down his career, and she's stepping into that slot. And so she needs Eric, to have, in order to be the successor to Eric Foner, she needs to be, a tenured academic. Yeah.
So the next thing to watch is what's the next step in her evolution. And there is a tiny class of fiction writers who have become so big, they have become publishers themselves, and they'll put their name on something in concert with someone else's name, and their name draws the eyeballs and gets the people to show up to read the other person.
Yeah.
But then they're taking 80% of the profit of the whole enterprise and doing the advertising and all the rest. So when does she make that jump?
Yeah.
And when will it happen? Or does she know that that's the next step of the evolution?
Well, and like Matt Taibbi's sort of racket newsroom now, I wonder sometimes, I like Matt's work a lot, but sometimes I wonder, does he write it all? Some of the stuff you can, has a real, Matt flavor. Others of it, not quite as much. And so that also sort of, there are all those sort of apocryphal stories about people who had, artists who had, a stable of apprentice artists who actually did most of the the mechanical kind of setup work on, even great paintings. And so it does strike me that, that you can build a whole industry around a name. And and that's
especially when you're a professor and you have a gaggle of students who come in new and fresh every year.
And grad students,
draw 2 or 3 at a time, and
yep. Especially
Patterson has an interesting approach now. He co-writes with famous people.
Right? Oh yeah, he wrote with Bill Clinton, didn't he?
Yeah, he wrote. Yeah, he's done that with several people now.
Yeah.
And
James Patterson is one of the models I was speaking of.
That's what I thought. Big. But I don't think that's kind of unique. Let's help somebody else get a book out under their name, and even the idea though that it's I don't know what you call it, historical fiction or some element of your unique world life experience is what's going to be the your contribution to this book. But talk about somebody who can just sit down and write stuff. That's he's the guy.
It's ghostwriting, but you're giving more credit to the ghostwriter. So another person who has done that model is Bill O'Reilly. Would take minor historians and he would co-write books with them about
what was his catchphrase as part of the title. His titles had a weird
but he had enough of a platform that if his name was on a thing, he would sell
somebody's going to buy
10, 20, 30,000 copies instantaneously and with no work. Although I don't know that he set up his own publishing space to keep a bigger share of the money, but
the Killing series. It was a killing.
I never got that part.
Killing Kennedy, killing England, killing the. Well, and what's his name tried to do that too. The other conservative.
Oh yeah.
Glenn
Accused
Beck.
of plagiarism.
Well, Glenn Beck had a write, and he did credit the guy. He had a writing partner. It was kind of weird because sort of like there do seem to be people who want to who want desperately to kind of get their idea out there, and if it's an idea that's that is supportive of a political position, then of course that makes it probably easier to kind of sell. Yeah, it's weird. Some of the things that are coming out recently, I look at them and I think, how did that get published? Like the what's her name, Whitney Webb, who's written that pair of books about One Nation Under Blackmail, that goes from it's mostly about Epstein, or at least it's sort of, the hook is Epstein, but she begins way before that, and she kind of talks about really the national security state that comes out of the Second World War, and then she traces, she goes through the Allen and John Foster Dulles era, and the military industrial complex, and and United Fruit, and for that reason, I am sort of interested in sort of connecting the dots. I mean, that's one of the things that fascinates me, and one of the reasons I'm doing this. Sort of.
Stacey Abrams has a book now, a fiction book. Advertised as fiction.
She's got two, actually.
Really?
She wrote the first one under a pseudonym, and no one knew it existed until she put out the second one, and it did well.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny because real academic historians have also sort of occasionally tried their hand at historical fiction, like Jill Lepore, or something like that, and oftentimes it's as a way to sort of play around with the idea, with like a counter historical thesis. What if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, or
the What If collection, one or two of them have been even edited by Niels Ferguson.
Yeah. Well, and he sort of is known for that sort of counter historical.
Yeah, but he hasn't. I don't think he's done any fiction direct. But the one I was thinking about was take another area, and you've got like 10 books from Carl Sagan on science, all at a popular level, plus all the science papers, and then you've got the one fiction book, Contact that became the film.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like you've got all these other sort of sciencey engineers ex-NASA people, but have written serious stuff but never really got anywhere. And then you've got people like, say, David Brin, with his fiction set, becomes a sudden high street name almost. So it certainly works both ways.
Yeah, that's true.
And I must admit, I like, seeing we're talking about authors, there's a relatively recently died British guy, Philip Kerr, who's mostly written thriller type fiction, and a big slice of it is all around one character guy called Bernie Gunter, who was a Berlin policeman before the war. Became a PI during the war because he wasn't going to join the party, and then became a spy for the KGB and the CIA and MI6 during and after. They're probably half of his output. He's done another couple that are World War II set, but have nothing to do with Berlin. But all of those, all figures start from a real, actual event. So one of Bernie's stories is he gets pushed down to Poland-Soviet border when it was still under German occupation, by Goebbels to go and get the real facts about the Katyn massacre of the Polish officer elite by the Russians, etc., etc. And for one of the ones that keeps coming up is he keeps having to go and work for Reinhard Heydrich. And then, of course, how could you miss Reinhardt's assassination? And the book that talks about that is deliberately done so he doesn't have to talk about it. It's done in a really weird combination, but it's a really good book. And you keep expecting the assassination to come up. And it sort of pops in at the end that he says, oh, my past boss is now defunct because the Brits assassinated him. And there's very little talk about the actual assassination or the fallout of it. But the reason for bringing him up is he'd done a couple of one-offs, two have to be told about. One is called Gridiron, but I think in the US it comes up under a different name. And I love it, partly because it's all about building engineering, where the control system, seeing we've been talking about AI, no doubt, decides that it overhears the people saying that they need to update it and put the next revision in. And that particular revision of the AI basically says, no, you're not going to kill me. And so, of course, what when you push the button for a lift, what do? The door's open, you step in, right? Virtually without looking to see if there's a floor there. So the AI, the two guys that were going to be doing the swap, come off floor 20 or something, push the button, walk into the lift, and there's no lift.
Yeah.
And of course they go, and then of course, then it's a case of a police investigation as to how did somebody kill them, or did they die of a natural death, or what? And slowly but surely, everybody in the building gets bumped off until the cops finally figure out exactly what's going on. And it's not bad, and it's at least 30 years old. So, and the other one is his one of his standalone thrillers. And seeing we're talking about writers and collaborations and stuff. There's a bunch of friends who are writers, and they all have one really good superpower in writing terms. One's really good at writing the dialogue, one's really good at doing characters, and the other one's really good at doing the outline. And for whatever reason, I can't remember exactly whether it gets explained or not, but the one who gets the outline is slightly bigger public-wise than the other two, and says, well, okay, let's form a writer's workshop. You write for me, I'll give you the outline and all the details, and you do your bits, and we merge it up, and we write it as though it's me because I'm the public face. And it's called research. And what happens is one of the other two decides to quit. And so the third one says, I can't let you kill the golden goose, as it were, that lays golden eggs. So he bumps him off. Anyway, and then tries to get the lead guy, the one that's fronting it all, in the frame for being the person who committed the murder. And so you see all this a bit in quite a weird chapter structure. So you know more than the characters do most of the time. Quite nice. And it's really good. So really, KFC.
Yeah, KFC was. There were KFCs everywhere, big, in the cities and in little kind of villages along the way. I mean, we we only went a lot around what they call the Golden Circle down the south, kind of from the southwest to about 2/3 of the way to the southeast, and they were everywhere. Oh, okay, thanks.
Yeah, so the James Patterson, interestingly, was one of those first big writers who did this thing. And interestingly, I think he was working on a PhD at Vanderbilt and then went into marketing and had a marketing career.
Huh.
So when he started writing, he knew how and why and started creating TV advertising for his books. And he fronted the upfront money himself to do television advertising for his books, which then made them sell way more.
Yeah.
And then because he knew in advance how to do that and that he was going to do that, he made separate deals with publishers to give him more of the money to cover that upfront cost. But these days, the hidden secret is it only takes maybe 500 copies of a book to sell through mainstream channels to start getting you on a bestseller list.
Yeah.
And most of the
depending on your category, yeah.
And most of the big five, your first print run will be maybe 10,000 copies, at which point the actual physical manufacturing cost of the book is $1.50, $2. And if you're most publishers look for what's called an author platform. Do you have enough eyeballs following you or care about you that if you publish a book, you will instantaneously sell half or more of a first print run,
right,
to get you to maybe a second print run?
Mm-hmm.
And most don't.
Right.
But if you're Heather Cox Richardson, it's an easy flyer for Basic Books to say, yes, if she publishes a book, we will sell 10,000 copies.
Oh, absolutely.
Within a year.
Yeah.
We'll sell out a first print run and we're in profit quickly.
Right. And then we're in paperback. Yeah.
And because we're only giving her, and the other secret is, as usually a first time author walking in the door, the best deal you're going to get, assuming you have an attorney to make sure it happens, is you're going to get 7% of sales after they've kind of broken even. So you got to sell a lot of books to actually make any money at all.
Yeah.
And usually if you're a first time author, and especially in like sci-fi or fantasy, they'll give you a 3-book deal and you make nothing on book 1. Yeah. And you only get to profit in maybe the end of book 2 or into book 3.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of authors will say, hey, I got a 3-book deal. And they're really taking a chance on me. They love me. I'm getting 3 books.
Right.
That's actually means you took the sucker's bet.
Yeah.
That you took the 3-book deal, and it's not what you think it was. And as an example, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck had a 3-picture deal with Miramax. And everybody knows what the first picture was. Almost nobody saw pictures 2 or 3, maybe.
Right.
But I think their deal, I think they made 75,000 each, roughly, maybe. I'd have to go look it up, but 75,000 for the first picture, and then 150 for the next 2.
Wow.
Maybe 300 for the third picture.
Yeah.
But by the time, so let's say, if I remember, Ben Affleck's third movie, because it was a corporate deal, Disney took over from Miramax, and Disney had the option on his third movie, or took the option, and I think it was it Armageddon, maybe? So he was making $5 million a picture by the time they exercised that deal.
Wow.
So, but instead of taking a $5 million payday to do that third movie for Disney, they paid him $150 to do like a massive blockbuster movie that he might otherwise have gotten $10 million on. So he got stuck with the sucker's deal.
Yeah.
Like, obviously it turned out okay for him. So
yeah.
And writers, in terms of their 3-book deal, the story goes well unless your name's Andy Weir. So,
Did you say what did you say, Tim?
in terms of a book deal that Chris was talking about, it works fine in that sense, except when your name is Andy Weir.
Well, yeah, he self-published his, right?
He self-published on a chapter by chapter, and then it got bought out, so he took that down. And on the day the book deal landed, he signed the movie deal. So he had a bit of a double paycheck that week.
Yeah. Yeah. He did all right. I mean, there are, yeah, especially serialized ones. I mean, what was the other one? Who's the guy who did the
Dickens?
Yeah, well, yeah, in history, Dickens did
Yeah.
a lot of that, but recently
Neil Gaiman did a serial one.
Neil Gaiman did it, yeah, but there was another one that was by an unknown person who it was a sort of a post-apocalyptic one. It'll come to me in a minute.
Oh, the 50 Shades of Grey was another self-published thing that blew up.
Oh, was it? I didn't know.
So she wrote that and self-published it on the indie market. And I think actually in her case, she took off because most people were reading it on a Kindle. So you could read this essentially at the time near smut, but you didn't have to advertise the smut you're reading on the subway or the bus.
Oh, right. Yeah.
If you're reading it on your Kindle.
You're reading your porno.
You get millions of sales. And then the publishing company came in after and said, essentially, we see your book doing really well. We want to put it in bookstores and really get it out there and put marketing behind it.
Right.
And essentially print money for you. So she got a sweetheart deal.
Yeah.
And, got much better than the sucker 7%.
Whereas the Harry Potter books very quickly ended up with a second cover so that it didn't look like you as an adult sitting on your commuter train was reading
something from Scholastic. Yeah.
Well, reading a kid's book with a really bright, semi-offensive cover in that sense, as opposed to an adult book.
Yeah.
So, and the adult covers in the UK, at least, all went black and white. They were all they were never photographic. They were always a sharp drawn, but in black, white with greys. But I also noticed a few people before they started coming out were actually reversing the dust cover because it was before the paperback came out. And it's like, I can tell because I got it for my kids and I was reading it to the kids. I can tell what book you're reading, even though you've reversed the cover, because it was a certain size and shape. It wasn't a normal adult book size either. It was a kid's book size. And so I did wonder about that. But anyway.
Yeah, I think the other series that I was thinking of was the Hugh Howey one, the Silo Saga, Dust, was the first one.
Oh yeah, he did quite well.
Yeah,
and he was but he hasn't really come back with much since, which is a bit of a shame. But
yeah,
sci-fi does seem to be the place that you can do it, or fantasy as well, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a long history of that too, right? There was, Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine and Amazing Stories and Astounding, and all those magazines that people did write. A lot of people wrote a lot of short stories, but also kind of serialized.
All of Asimov was there before to start with.
Right, Asimov, Heinlein, yep. Yeah, all those old guys. The guy who didn't do that, I think, probably was Frank Herbert, because I think he just sort of exploded onto the scene with Dune.
He just dumped out Dune, and that was it, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that was, and that went in such a weird, different direction. I mean, when you think about it, for its time, that much depth in Middle Eastern and Arab, kind of culture.
It's a more good-sized book, isn't it?
Hmm.
Well, if you want to go weird sci-fi outcomes, there's a guy named L. Ron Hubbard who started in that sci-fi space.
Yeah.
Who then decided it would be way better and easier. So he started his own publishing company and then turned it into a religion.
Yeah.
So he could get it all tax-free.
Mm-hmm.
But he literally was buying up, and he did something. I don't know if anyone had done it before. It may likely have been the case that had been going on. But let's say you're a big politician or maybe the son of an ex-president. So you write a book and you can get the Republican Party to pick up the tab to buy 10, 20,000 copies to then give away at events or to sell for reduced prices.
Yeah.
But you can go and buy directly from the publisher. Amazon and almost every bookstore buys it at a 40% discount. So you can go and do that same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And all those sales, if you do it properly, count toward your bestseller status list.
Right.
So you can immediately be in the top 10 on the New York Times bestseller list because you have verified sales through a sales chain, which is how you get on most of those lists.
Right.
But really, it's some third party buying mass quantities that people probably aren't actually reading. If you're Stephen King, yes, people are actually probably reading your stuff when they buy it, but
right.
A lot of the others are weird flukes that are sales but not actual sales.
Right.
And so
So
L. Ron Hubbard definitely did that. He was buying copies of his own books to push them into the bestseller list. And you do it as a loss leader. And then once you're on the list, everybody notices, oh, hey, this book by L. Ron Hubbard's on the top 10 list. Maybe I should, but it must be good. I'm going to buy it.
Must be something to it. Yeah.
And then go from there.
Right. Yeah.
So,
yeah. It's kind of interesting. Have you read anything? Have you read any of the, or I guess it's been all over YouTube as well. Neil Gaiman and Amanda and Corey Doctorow have sort of been opining about kind of creativity and copyright and that sort of thing for I don't know a decade or more now, right? About just about
Corey's made it a career.
Yeah. Yes.
So in terms of these oversold books that go to remainder stores and then you end up with a sticker on it when they come out the other end after a while that says, just please take it. Do you recycle those books into the circular economy by using them as toilet paper, or do you burn them for heat? That's the question. Bringing it back to the book. Kate
Rayworth would say, don't do that.
It's funny. I used to shop. I remember, my parents were high school teachers in Massachusetts when I was growing up, and we used to go, and when I was little, Barnes and Noble actually was a liquidator. And, so we used to go to Barnes and Noble and pick up remaindered books. And there were some other ones that were even, that didn't have names, but but that used to be, that used to be a thing. And then, and then they started, and then of course Barnes and Noble started, printing their own versions of, out of copyright things. They were kind of the first, everybody's doing that now on, print on demand in Amazon, but they had, all those cheap volumes of, Dickens and Poe and Hawthorne and, Doughnut.
Well, the big publishers were doing that before. Pocket books made their career starting to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So if you really want to do that, Tim, you take those books, and if your handwriting is small enough, you can do what it was a Count Almasay in Ondaatje's The English Patient used Herodotus, but he wrote his own commonplace book
interlinear,
in the between the lines or in the margins.
Yep.
So that's how you can reuse those books.
Yeah, I had a friend who used to do that. She used to just run them, flip them over, and journal in them from back to front.
So ideally, though, as far as the circular economy is concerned, what you should do is just make them wet, put them in a stack, and grow mushrooms.
Yeah, mushrooms are good. Yeah, that's kind of one of the. I mean, and this idea of sort of taking advantage. Really, the pocketbook was a different. I mean, it was legitimately a different format, and there were people. I mean, my dad tells stories about buying paperback books in the PX and just always having a book in his back pocket. So that was a legitimately kind of a new medium that extended print culture into a different readership. But even like going all the way back to sort of the beginning of American publishing, right? Isaiah Thomas, the guy who was the Worcester, Massachusetts publisher in the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. I have a catalog of his from like 1800 that has just it's filled with continental titles, especially English, especially British titles, of course, because there's a big English speaking readership in America in the 1800. But these are all basically free to him because there's no effective enforcement of patent or copyright internationally, right? So he can take anything that was published someplace else and just feel free to reprint it here.
Just needs to be in English.
Yeah, and there's and it's actually, I mean, there's a guy who it's kind of funny. I used it as a and this was one of the first indications to me that there was a class structure in history. I used this book called "Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life," and it was by this guy named William Gilmore, or Gilmore Leamy. He sometimes had a hyphenated last name, and he had this idea that in the beginning of the 19th century, print culture exploded, and to a much greater extent than we think about, sort of in the centers in Boston, the center of culture and places like that. But he said, he went around, sort of throughout New England and into the sticks and looked at people's estate inventories of what was because everything was itemized to the smallest pot and pan, and books, title by title by title. And so he had these very, very extensive inventories of the books that people had in their houses, when an estate inventory was done. And it was ridiculous. It was unbelievable how, I mean, you would expect that, people out in the sticks, they're going to have a Bible, and that's going to be it, or maybe, Pilgrim's Progress or something like that. And they had these just crazy, incredible libraries. And that, and I wrote a paper about that, and that was the first time I noticed, Heather said, why'd you pick him? He's nobody. He's like this guy isn't, he's just a nut, because he had this really weird idea, and and he had documented it just crazy, extensively, and but he hadn't amounted to anything, right? He had written, he had been working on a second project. He had a website, but then he had dropped dead. And so it was like this unfinished work. And yeah, and so I found that really, really interesting. So I actually started, looking kind of at inventories of, just the people that I was interested in, like Charles Knowlton and stuff, and looking at the libraries that they have. But yeah, print went much farther than you would expect, because you would imagine that it takes a press, or at least a bookstore, right, in a village or town, in order to actually make this thing work at all. And as it turned out, it really didn't. People traveled enough that they would pick up books when they were someplace, and then there it is, William J. Gilmore, and sometimes hyphenated as Gilmore -Lehne, Leany.
You remind me, Dan, of one of the early bestseller causes in that ghostwriting marketing thing. So at the end of Ulysses S. Grant's life, he was, declining rapidly and had lost, I think, a Ponzi scheme wiped his personal fortunes out.
Mm-hmm.
But he was best friends with international famous bestseller Mark Twain.
Yeah.
So he wrote an autobiography, and Mark Twain published it and marketed it for him, and created groups of traveling salesmen across the US and leveraged his marketing and publishing acumen and experience to get people to sell this autobiography door to door to people who thought Grant had saved the world.
Yeah.
And and then that was one of the first huge, multi bestsellers in American history because of that reason.
Mm-hmm.
So it was fairly close to that kind of, hey, I can take my knowledge of this space, and he didn't ghostwrite it, but he certainly did the next best thing and pushed it out, and every home in America, or at least the ones in the North,
right,
had a copy of that book.
Yeah. And then he prevented his own autobiography from being published for a century. Which maybe that had something to do with that experience. I actually have one of the first Kindle books I ever bought was the Mark Twain autobiography, but it's just too big. I haven't read it. I mean, I've dipped into it, but it's crazy. Yeah. So in any case, we have a book that we're supposed to be talking about.
Should we talk about the denouement?
So
well, I think, to me, the end of this was almost a letdown, because it's really the early part of the, hey, we should reframe this, that is the bigger part of the story. And the tougher part of the story is, how the hell do you actually do it and affect the change and the reframing of an entire economic system, which is difficult and painful to do. And in fact, since we're talking about publishing too, it's I actually did look, and it's Chelsea Green Publishing, I think, was the company that put this out,
right,
from White River Junction, Vermont.
Right.
And it's a reasonable, I don't know that I'd say they're a mid-list.
But they tend to focus on green. They tend to focus on things like, regenerative agriculture and sustainability and, energy policy and things like that.
And you probably noticed, Story, at least you recognized it, because that's your area. But when I look at it, I've not heard of any of the other books on their list at all. And this probably was, for them, one of the biggest sellers they've had in the last decade, I would imagine. Because it got out pretty far and wide.
Yeah, they've done pretty. I mean, they have, they've done really well with kind of permaculturally, related titles, and sort of the turn towards renewability kind of thing. I think but it did surprise me that this came from them.
Well, although I noticed too, I bought my physical copy when we started in early 2023, and based on the markings in the front, it looks like mine is a second printing. Which means if I had to rule of thumb guess, they're just over sales of 10,000 copies.
Yeah.
If they even did a first print run that large,
Right.
which a company like this might only go 5,000 copies.
I haven't seen a physical copy of this book, but in my experience, their production values on most of their volumes are a little bit higher, so their runs might be a little bit shorter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I even saw this book originally because I saw a physical copy in a bookstore.
Mm.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, their books aren't cheap. You know, they've got the, you know, integrated forest gardening is $45, and I mean, and filled with pictures.
Yeah, those books are not cheap to make.
Yeah, yeah, they do a nice, and you know, and they've got Maria Rodale's new book is coming out from them, or I think it's
yeah,
out.
but in UK wise, it's Penguin Random House, so it's not a small.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And
well,
yeah,
for
the gardening permaculture stuff. I mean, the original, it's actually, I think, the third book that I know about for permaculture itself,
right,
is still the one book published by the original publisher, owned by the two authors, and it's literally a one-shop shop.
Oh,
I don't know if it focuses well, but there's a part of the Green Press Initiative. They tell you how they're preserving ancient forests and, you know, all the, you know, the green things they're doing and publishing the book, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing for this particular book.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of I'm scrolling through their, you know, their online catalog right now, and yeah, I do have their. They had Harvey Ussery's The Small Scale Poultry Flock, which was it was a nice production printed on, you know, glossy paper with 4-color. It's weird.
It's scintillating reading, I have to say.
It was great. It was actually great. Harvey Ussery he was funny as hell. And you know, so but they have, you know, it was people like that, Harvey Ussery, who's friends, you know, he's a weirdo hippie. He's friends with Paul Stamets, and you know, but then the organic grain grower. The other thing, actually, the thing that just you know, in holistic goat
don't wag your index cards at us, Dan.
Yeah, holistic goat care. I mean, but now they've sort of transitioned into kind of lefty political stuff too, because right, they also published Celia Farber's Serious Adverse Events, the uncensored history of AIDS, which is very, I mean, it's a hard hitting and really well researched book, much more so than RFK's, although he quotes extensively from her, and he actually I'm going to say it out loud, plagiarizes her, because in passages where he cites her and has something that she says in quotes, the rest of the entire page will be lifted directly from her book, which I don't think is. I don't think that it's fair to say he's just a new author and he doesn't know better.
Yeah, or that the publisher wouldn't,
or that the publisher would have let that go. Yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah, but yeah, so you know, it's kind of weird. I mean, little publishers. We had been sort of talking, you know, for years about sort of the demise of publishing and all that, and then, you know, kind of little publishers, you know, with a niche like Chelsea Green or like
Verso is another good example.
Verso, actually, that's what I was just going to say. Verso, yeah, the lefties. You know, somebody who's got a following, right, and can, you know, I mean, I get, you know, and actually Verso every 6 months or so, that everything will be like 40% off. So
yeah.
So they have,
or they'll have a specific enough niche publishing model that, like Verso, I think will offer you I think they still offer subscriptions, essentially, like for X amount a year, we'll send you every book we publish.
Right. Yep.
Type of thing, which is an interesting little sub model.
Which I think you can expect that you're going to get. I mean, if you like that kind of thing, you're going to expect that you're going to get things that that you're. Oh, I have that square foot gardening book.
Yeah,
that's a classic as well.
Although I think this one actually has it fits into their publishing model, but it was wedged in rather than kind of pulled and sucked in, or maybe one of the editors knew of her thesis and said, let's pull this in. But I think this is kind of broken through into a bigger public, or at least I would hope it is in terms of a conversation, because I also see pieces of her thesis that fit into some subtle changes over the last decade and change of how economics is approached as a thing. And it'd be nice to see, although I did spend some time and I tried to look up economics textbooks for the college market that are being taught with this as a kind of philosophical underpinning, or that at least it's mentioned as a thing.
Yeah.
And I did not find any, although there's a handful of like one or two OER textbooks that are kind of entering that market, but it's specifically geared more towards students who want this type of philosophy in their economics. How can we use economics to make a better world?
Yeah.
Type of thing. So those textbooks are written more towards that as you're still getting this traditional old micro macro views, but it's how can we use these things as tools to help make society better rather than just to enrich ourselves as uber capitalists.
Yeah.
Or insane libertarians.
Insane libertarians is the best kind. Let me just find there is another I think there's another book that the guy that I was partnering with likes to use. Oh, it's actually challenging me with a two-step.
Well, I also found it interesting too, and I don't think we've mentioned it thus far, but my copy of the book has essentially it's a chalkboard diagram writing of the title and the model she's doing, which very specifically essentially says or communicates, I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
And I'm drawing on a chalkboard to students. Here's the new way we need to think.
Yeah.
Which was an interesting marketing setup for this as a book.
Yeah. Yeah. Mine has it's in color, but it's similar to that. It's I can't find the environmental economics that my buddy uses, but so and then the appendix where she talks about she's got that chart of what goes into the dimensions. Is that anything we wanted to talk about? I don't know. I think it's interesting where she says, well, there's no global control variable yet defined. Yeah. So do you think the idea, the image, I mean, her kind of initial argument, her initial thesis was, you can change the world with a pencil, right? And that this, this metaphor of the donut was going to be a big game changer. So do we think it worked?
It was a nice framing to start the book and end the book. because I think really the first sentence and the last sentence were just that.
Yeah.
And there were one or two mentions along the way that kind of harkened back to that. But this came out in 2017, and it's been on my radar for at least a year.
Yeah.
But I have yet to see anyone outside of her immediate circle or her in any media talk about this as a diagram or a concept. But I've also, even before I read the book, knew what the broad thesis was as a model.
Yeah.
And I have pitched it to people as, you should read this book. It's an interesting concept of how to frame economics.
Yeah.
Or I should say, maybe not reframe, but re-encircle economics. So it has been useful to me in settings where I've talked about this or talked about economics as a thing, to be able to reframe that concept. But I have yet to see that as a thing outside of it.
Yeah, I like the idea of economists as advisors, and basically, which would be their method, I assume, of influence. But it'd be interesting to know if any decision makers anywhere play into this. I found a lot of the book very depressing, actually, in that it was a great combination of information about why change doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And, the whole idea of, I forget, next to the last chapter, the one before, whatever, about there's so much about the role of government as the only real mechanism because of potential change. And then if you start thinking about Citizens United and the pressures on government officials to regulate and to pop out tax rates and taxing not just income but wealth, some of the stuff she brings up, it just doesn't work that way. And I don't know how you change it when the influence, if you analyze the influences that are at play, how would that ever change?
Yeah.
I've noticed, and I would hope the same thing might happen here, but Richard Rothstein a few years ago wrote a book on redlining called The Color of Law. And this last week, he's got a new book out that he co-wrote with his daughter that essentially says, okay, here's this thing that happened historically. And this new book is essentially, from what I gather from the cover, a set of recipes and changes we can make now to help fix and remedy and address those past wrongs.
Right.
For not only governmental people, but for people making decisions in everyday life. Or at least that's the impression I get. I'm going to go pick up a copy actually later today.
Yeah, it does seem like that's necessary, right? That next, yeah.
So she's now written this book to reframe the discussion. I want book number 2 of, and she has a few examples, I think, is some of the benefit of the later chapters here of slow changes, but I think people need
when she talks about
the
wealthy countries and even the decline in, I forgot, efforts to bring the economy more in line with some of these ideas, she's still talking about a rate of influence or rate of change. I mean, she's talked about, and if you look at the global climate change, maybe the wealthy countries, she talks about these percentages of changing from 8 to 10% down to 1 to 2% or whatever. But the problem is the percentages that have been accomplished are still moving, toward increasing damage rather than nothing's negative. Let's put it that way. So,
yeah. Well, I think another part of the problem is, or another part of the lack of resolution is that, you know, we begin, which I thought that the kind of the inciting incident at the very beginning was great. I thought it really kind of worked for me. You know, the whole, you know, we've got this, you know, this Yuan Yang, you know, who comes to Oxford and, you know, and starts, you know, becoming really, you know, just pissed off and disillusioned with the way that economics is taught at Oxford, and, you know, and sort of begins, you know, to try to think about other ways and envision other ways. And then we get to the "we are all economists" now at the end, and, you know, we're back to this person, and now she is, you know, now she has a she's got a master's degree. She turned down a PhD, but she's, you know, she's working with this rethinking economics thing, which is, you know, which is still very much, I mean, it still just strikes me as, you know, sort of experts and the elite are going to have a conversation and figure out, you know, what the deal is, and you know, I mean, I would have been much happier, I guess. I would have been much more satisfied if, you know, she had gone and joined, you know, gone to the barricades, right? And, you know, and you know, and joined, you know, some type of resistance organization or Occupy movement or something like that. And, you know, had gotten something, you know, something much more grassroots as a potential solution, which I think, I mean, I don't want to put any words in Ray Worth's mouth, but I imagine she probably doesn't imagine that could happen, right? That there's enough intelligence at, you know, on the barricades, you know, or behind the barricades at Occupy, right? Which I think, you know, if you read, like, you know, Graeber's, you know, Democracy Project book, it seems like there was a lot of kind of sophistication, you know, both in terms of, you know, their level of thinking about the economy and the society, and also, you know, the ways that they tried to organize themselves. So it seems like,
well, so I think some of it comes down to having a simple enough story to tell that the average American can say, yes, that sounds like a plausible thing to me.
Yeah.
So it's easy in the debt crisis situation that we've just gone through for really, it started 6 months ago at least. The common story, especially from the right, is as a government, we need to balance our accounting the same way your household does, which is just the biggest load of foolish crap on the planet, because it doesn't work that way. The US government has way more levers than my household will ever have to do a better job. But because
to permanently live beyond its means, and to, you know, and to go to war rather than pay its bills, all kinds of things. Yeah.
But that story is a strong and a powerful one. So when you say it and you repeat it and repeat it, the average American thinks that, yes, America is a household and we should balance our books, and and somehow that's a doable thing in the political climate in which we live. You know, if it was not a doable thing in the 50s, it's an impossible thing now.
Right.
But I think this at least gives kind of a medium deep story that gets closer to the simple story that you need to be able to say to the, you know, Harry and Mary beer can, like, this is a thing, and be able to tell that story in a way that makes sense to them without delving into the hairiness of the deep math and complexity theory of what's going on. But I think it also kind of brings in a little bit of some of what were more American indigenous economic ideas of how to arrange your culture and society around things that enrich not only the individuals, but the groups in the village and the city and the ever increasing space, the donut of people.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing that comes up with this is you've got to convince enough people to shift. And you look at even the last couple of weeks, say back in the UK, there's been a few instances of just stop oil and exile rebellion, court cases coming through. And at the moment, it's almost random as to whether you get off on it, and whether you get off as in we're going to convict you of the crime, but the sentence is nothing because we agree with you, but you break the law anyway. Or there are instances where they say, no, you didn't commit a crime. You have undertaken adequate damage for your protest, which is allowed, right? And I think the bit that's missing from this one is a bit of that next step, as in how do you take the idea and make it politically work? I mean, one of her examples is in Germany, where they just said, instead of giving you income tax, we're going to give you tax against the fuel you buy and tax against other stuff that you buy that has environmental impact over and above the norm. And so the disposable income for most Germans is about the same. It's just where it's taxed at. So I'm thinking more that she needed one more chapter that is an economic version of, say, Catherine Hayhoe's Saving Us from the Climate Crisis, where she goes through 5 or 6 big techniques on how to engage with the others, whether it be the skeptic of climate change or the political other, or even the ideological other, and get them to take a step in the right direction for what they think of as being their reasons. But all you've done is reframe it in such a way that it covers their reasons. So things like flood control and drought are 2 ends of the same pencil, in effect. So if I can rewild the river, it stops bursting its banks so much and flooding your land. But what land is then caught up in a river that naturally does its thing across the landscape gives you a resilient crop space to go as a pasture. And that's the bit that I think is missing. She's done, I thought, as a reasonable job of saying this is all the arguments that are being happened, but not take that next step.
Yeah.
And it's a case of, I mean, Pat brought in Ostracy's and Conway's latest book, and you go through some of the history that they talk about there, or they have talked about even in Merchants of Doubt and in lectures and YouTubes and stuff.
Right. Have you read this one, Tim?
I'm reading.
Oh, it sounds like we've got a quorum then for putting it on the list.
Yeah. I like it in the sense of, partly because it's a bit more of American corporate history. And I was talking to somebody who I'm chatting with a lot now, and was saying that I read a book by a guy called Richard Maybury back in either very late 70s or very, very early 80s that was described the history of the English country, of the British countryside, and was very much talking about what's the next step for that countryside. And it sort of switched me on to the fact of what was common land so much is now not so. We've still got big swathes of it as common land, but they're not common in the same way as it used to be, as I can go and dig it up and put my rhubarb down. But it then led through a couple of other things where companies, as much as they are trying to sell us a product, are also not really being very honest of how that product gets made.
Yeah. And
there was somebody talking a bit about weight loss and controlling your diet. And it was he had a jokey metaphor, was you could go down the first part of the supermarket, which is all the veg and fruit, and you could go down the back of the market, which is all the bakery and butchery. But if you ever go in the middle,
you're screwed. Absolutely.
Yeah, the middle will expand.
Yep.
And I thought, yeah, that's a good one. As in, particularly when we came off the land and we became industrialized, and therefore all the corporations have an element of that progress is their kickstart in many respects. And so we don't actually know how to butcher a pig or how to grow a cabbage in the main. And that's where the number of people are. Yet with the US, I wonder, because of course they all vote blue, but all the rural people vote red.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the perpetuation of the Kellogg's cornflakes is good for you, but you really want this sugar-coated one or this fruit-flavored one, which has never seen a piece of fruit in its life, etc., etc. So there's all that disconnect, and we don't understand that disconnect because we're not in that industry.
Well, it's weird though, because where I live in, I mean, there are two sides of Minnesota, I suppose. There's, in southern Minnesota, there are, and in Iowa as well, there are a lot of meatpacking plants, and they are very, it's industrial agriculture. It's the end point of industrial agriculture, right? So cattle come from feedlots, or pigs come from feedlots, and they get industrially disassembled, usually by very, very low paid, illegal aliens who don't, they don't have to give them good benefits because they're illegals. And then up here we have, and that's very, I guess that's very red as well. Then you've got the cities where it's very blue. And then, and then up here in the north where I live, you've got, I do know how to butcher chickens and turkeys. My wife comes from a fishing family. We haven't really done mammals ourselves, so I've never hunted and gutted out a deer or but I do buy a cow from a guy, and I go and I watch it get butchered and sort of skinned and gutted and then taken to a locker where they do that only for they're not USDA inspected, so they only do it for non-resale. But that, we do know where, our food comes from and all of that. And we have raised, goats and sheep and, but this is a very red area. This is people are very, but people are, kind of red in the sense that they're conservative in the old fashioned terminology of conservatism. They are really annoyed by, culture war. And probably, most of them are religious enough that they will also.
But for instance, the other one that's come up recently is obviously California taxes people and taxes fuel in one way. But given they will die for freedom, you're allowed to put solar panels up on your roof, regardless.
Mm-hmm.
Yet you go to that freedom-loving state called Texas, or you go to that freedom-loving state of South Carolina, and the building zoning laws are built in such a way that it is exceedingly difficult to put solar panels up,
mm-hmm.
because those rules and regulations are being paid for by the utilities.
Right.
And it's that sort of connection. As much as we might not know how to grow beans or carrots or to skin a cow, there's limitations to that. And yes, you particularly, you're rural, but could you say the same for everybody that lives in St. Paul's? Probably not, right? But most of us don't even grow a tomato plant on their balcony, right? And it's the disconnect with where things come from and how things come, and therefore there's secondary effects that is causing the climate change is almost the same. There's a huge overlap, I think, with the ways that corporates are protecting their space. Even when you get down to saying, oh yes, Mr. Buffett is such a nice man, yet he lobbies on the behalf of the airlines. Not because he owns one, but he owns a significant slice of four of them.
Right.
So he owns more airline than almost any airline owns. And so he's an effective lobbyist for the airline and the airline industry and flying, etc., etc. As in, you can't limit this, we must have as many slots as possible. We want airports to be open, blah, 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 etc. So it's those backroom smoky, it's a bit like you guys before you had primaries, where you just decided in the smoky back room who was going to be the candidates and stuff. And exactly the same as used to be, particularly with unions. Same difference. It's not a left or a right thing. It's how are those decisions being made, and how are they being made such that they're going to be transparent? And that's the thing that governments don't want to let go of, including elements of the professional civil services. As in, you can't let them know how the sausage is made, which I think is one of your Americanisms for it, because you'll realise how stupid it is in many cases. And Europe-wise has started having, I can't remember exactly what they're called. They're called people's conferences or something, where the government, the Irish one did one recently on abortion. They got so stuck because they're so religious about it, as in Catholic versus Protestant, we're not going to give an inch either way, etc., etc. But the only way to get movement on it was they gave it to a people's parliament or a people's conference.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I can't remember what degree of legality that was attached to the answer, but they've taken the answer and used a fair amount of it in the current legislation and freed it up. such that people are now leaving, going on holiday from the Northern Ireland, going to the Catholic Republic to get abortions.
Huh.
It used to be the other way around.
Yeah.
You know, so we've had a slight conservative reaction in Northern Ireland that has slowly eroded the rights to abortion there as a part of the UK. And so the Northern Ireland girls were going to the UK or to the Republic now as well.
Wow.
And yeah, it's and I'm not sure with the economy because I haven't looked at it in quite the same way yet. But the way I see an awful lot of the climate stuff is there is this small percentage, call it 5%, that are so dead against it, and so many of them dead against it for the wrong. They've drunk the Kool-Aid and they don't understand, and you get real violent pushback. I mean, there've been instances where people are complaining to the police about protests for exile protests, etc. And yet the people that get arrested at those protests are the people that in cars trying to run the people over when they're stretching across the road. There was a YouTube on Double Down, I think, which is like a lefty free press thing in the UK, where they showed the Chief of Police for London, the Commissioner for the Met, in a parliamentary committee room when Exile was protesting out on the road. And two of the Tory MPs in there browbeated the commissioner for not clearing the road so they could get to the committee meeting, etc., etc. And it turns out, of course, Exile's very good at making sure they stay well within the law as it is. And when the police chief turned around and explained, well, that's the current law, as and when you people change it, we'll act to the current law. And it was a case of one of them particularly turned around and said, you have to clear it no matter what, because I say so. And it's like, yeah, you're just one MP. You're not yet the law. And the police chief really ripped back on it. It's really quite refreshing that the police chief would actually push back, knowing full well that if he didn't, I suppose that the rest of the committee would round on him like a pack of wolves, really. But it was quite good. So I think this book-wise, she missed the trick in there needing to be chapter 9, or chapter 8, whatever, that gave us this is how we move it. So in that sense, I agree with Chris a lot in that sense. That there needs to be, what is the next step? You know, do your getting things done GTD thing. What's the you've got a project. What's the next step on all the different fronts? And it's clearly a complex problem. There's no point. I mean, with one of the memes that came around this week, because we've had reports coming through showing how badly the current government has dealt with the water companies who also deal with the sewage, where they're increasing the fine for your dog pooping on the beach. And they're decreasing the fine for discharging untreated sewage because you're a waterworks.
Yeah.
So,
I think introduction and chapter 1, to answer your question, Chris, was what we had talked about before I went off on my trip.
So how many pages is that, Chris?
About 100. Or up to
Okay.
101 in the print copy I've got.
I've got a major writer's crit tomorrow with three pieces, and I haven't read them yet. So that's why tomorrow wiped out. So yeah,
So
I've got the book though.
The early stuff reads pretty quick and isn't super dense. So
yeah. I mean, it is according to Kindle, it's 418 pages. So
I kind of lost track of the chain. Which book is that?
this is Knowing What We Know.
Oh, okay.
Simon Winchester.
I haven't really looked ahead to see kind of thematically if we did prologue and 1, and then 2 and 3, and then 4 and 5, and then how much is there to 6? That's about 6 by itself is about 100 pages, so that would be a 4-week project. Yeah, I listened to the beginning of it too, Mark, and aside from the pedantic nature of the narrator voice, I think it probably will go all right. It seemed like I was in an Anglican cathedral or something there for a while. But yeah.
Some of the later sections have more pictures and illustrations too, which is kind of interesting. They don't seem to be evenly placed throughout the book.
Oh, there's Hal on page 315. I get far without a picture of the eye of Hal. Apparently, Tesla tried to use the Hal eye and they had to give it back for their. They tried to use it for their whatever they call it, Sentry or.
Well, I gotta imagine marketing would have said, "No, that's not a good idea, Dave."
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, that'll work. I guess the last thing that struck me about Kate Rayworth is I didn't really completely understand the obsession with Donella Meadows. I mean, it's like I get systems thinking and and limits to growth, but it's not that real. I mean, it's not. It's like it seemed like a reach.
Yeah, well, I've done probably more reading into. Take care, John. And my background especially in the deeper heavy math is in information theory and early history of that as a mathematical subject leading into systems theory in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And then I've done a reasonable amount of reading or at least some surface reading in complexity theory as it relates to economics.
Yeah.
And I was hoping for more like in-depth stuff, and she doesn't even she mentions it as a topic, but doesn't really scratch the surface to the level that I might have hoped she would. But it's also I think it gets her further afield from the point she's trying to make, and just muddies the waters.
Yeah.
So it's probably good that she didn't.
Yeah, and yet she comes back to to her in the last couple of paragraphs. She's like, now remembering what Donella said. It's like, really?
Yeah, it's like, is that the best way to leave off versus go back to? I would have preferred a little more emphasis on some of the early stuff with the you know, paying attention to the home as the heart of the enterprise.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's the people and the home, and I feel like in pieces of American culture, there's kind of a new hearkening back to the idea of humanism in, you know, the late medieval period and the early Renaissance that's coming back. And I see it in some places like this in economics. I see a lot of it in the spaces that I see and read about education,
right?
Where it's, and particularly since the pandemic, where it's, we're failing our kids in part because we're not treating them well. We're not treating them as humans first, but just things to sit and memorize lessons and lectures we shouldn't do that anymore.
Right.
And so that those ideas of humanism kind of leaching back into the conversation.
Well,
we just haven't had.
And also the home, you know, the kind of home and hearth thing as a sort of a recognition of, I thought that she was on, you know, she was on to something when she was talking about, you know, the unrecognized labor, right? You know, and bringing that, you know, kind of bringing that back into the picture, bringing back, you know, because, you know, and oftentimes I sort of push back on the idea that, well, you know, women weren't in the picture, you know, in American history, right? Because, you know, oftentimes, I mean, even with, you know, the arguments about, you know, women voting, I mean, there was an assumption really, you know, for amongst a lot of people, not all of them probably, you know, for a long time, that, you know, that the man, the head of household, was casting the vote for the household. Right. And that it wasn't just about, you know, we don't care anything about anybody else's opinion, but that, you know, that there's some type of, you know, there's some type of process of decision making or consensus building or something that happens before the dude goes to the poll.
Yeah. You know? Which would be nice if that's what were happening. And it was a horrific experience watching it, but I highly recommend everyone do so. But I watched the documentary this week. I want to say it's on Netflix, called Shiny Happy People. It looks into the Duggar family and the 19 and counting TLC documentary. But it goes, essentially it makes the argument that there is a religious underpinning and a religious movement of fundamentalism that was wholly missing from this TV series that you just did not see.
Oh, wow.
And they approach it from the perspective of the scandals that destroyed the show and took the show down, with the child porn charges and the sexual abuse. But they look into the religious movement of the group that underpins the philosophy that family had, and the amount of abuse and the painful grooming that goes into how they homeschool and kind of build that culture.
Yeah.
Oh my God! Like
Amish.
Yeah.
You know,
the other one
that kind of thing. It puts the head of household he's the head of household, and he lays down the law.
Yeah.
And if you don't get in line with it, you're literally physically beaten.
Yeah.
But you know, the show never showed, although they took snippets of the book that the wife wrote and talked about a concept called blanket training, where you put a baby on a blanket and you put a toy they want just outside, and every time they reach for it, you hit them.
Oh, wow.
To teach them not to do that. And it starts at, like, you know, below toddler stage.
Yeah.
So that by the time you're 18 or 19, especially if you're a woman, you're not going to speak out against anything, because there is a great chain of being that's like done to the nth degree.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. Well, okay.
And I just was horrified by, you know, some of it. So be prepared.
Yeah.
Like, Yeah, like this is the piece of America that exists, but no one's talking about.
Yeah.
And it's hurting us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes. Okay.
And I wish we had that view that
I stand corrected.
It was more like if what you said was the head of household had built some internal consensus rather than laying it down the law the way God did to Moses, you know. Although even God laying it down to Moses would have been a better,
Yeah. See you later, Jim.
Compared to this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So yeah, maybe my thing is more wishful thinking. I don't know. I suppose it depends on, I mean, there's so much when when there isn't transparency, there's just so much that people get away with. It's incredible.
And it's almost the system was designed to not have transparency, which makes it even worse.
Right.
Or the ability to speak up and say, hey, I'm being mistreated, or I'm this or that is happening. It's been so normalized into some pieces of a culture that it just, there's no way out of it.
Yeah. Which is, an indication of how far we think we've come, but really maybe necessarily haven't. Anyways, looks like it's time for people to go. So so next week we'll do the kind of first 100 pages of Knowing What We Know, the prologue and the first chapter. We'll try. I guess we're going to try to get through this in 4 weeks, if possible. And then it sounds like we have good consensus on moving to the new Conway Oresky's book after that, going back to sort of practical solutions to all of our problems.
Oh, and I dropped it into the chat earlier, but Melissa Rivers donated her mother's 65,000 card collection of jokes to the National Comedy Museum.
Oh, wow.
In Jameson, New York, I think. So
cool. Huh.
They have some vague plans of maybe making it accessible and hopefully they'll put it online, but
like a Lumon archive.
Yeah, there was at least and I've got a copy of it. I haven't watched it yet, but apparently there's a 2010 documentary where she spends a few minutes standing in front of it and talking about it and pulling out a few cards and discussing it. So I want to catch that documentary. I think it's on Tubi for free streaming right now. And
I liked the yellow legal pad thing that was in the Seinfeld special too. Although it wasn't atomic enough. It was kind of all there. And
I noticed when I went to the bookstore this week, there's a relatively new book out by Robert Rubin called The Yellow Pad. Making better decisions in an uncertain world. I think he's an ex-Fed or banker background. Yeah. But I was thinking about that too when the Seinfeld thing popped up.
Like back to the Benjamin Franklin comparison on a yellow legal pad.
Oh, I just read the book jacket and marked it. I wrote it down in my list of things to take a look at this week.
Cool.
But I haven't gone further than that.
Right. I actually started listening to, and I think it was because I heard them raving about it on Joe Rogan. I started listening to a very weird thing that just came out a few years ago about the I guess I didn't get a Kindle. I just got an Audible about the Manson murders. And that apparently promises in the later chapters to link it to things like MK Ultra and sort of government shenanigans, which will be interesting.
Some of that almost sounds like conspiracy theory, though. I think
Absolutely, yeah, totally conspiracy. I mean, well, and like I said, I was also dipping into kind of Whitney Webb, which is also very kind of conspiracy theory-ish, but does kind of create this little network diagram, not an actual physical one, but in the narrative that connects the dots, between the military industrial complex and the Dulles brothers, kind of through the 70s, through the assassinations into the 70s, the Gulf War, and the Iran Contra thing, and then
I'm curious how much of that popped up because there was a potential parole decision this week for an ex-Manson follower.
Oh, was there? Wow.
Yeah. Or it popped up in California because she's in prison out here. But this week, I think it was early in the week, there was some minor brouhaha that she potentially could be paroled soon.
Oh, interesting. Well, I guess that so far I've only listened to the first couple of chapters of this, and it does seem like this guy, what he's doing really to begin with is he's sort of debunking the which apparently Helter Skelter was the biggest true crime book ever published. And the judge who or he wasn't he was the judge, he was the prosecutor. Right.
And you don't mean just by thickness, right?
No, I mean by sales. Yeah, I mean it was the biggest selling true crime book in the genre's history, and he's basically dismantling it, and the whole kind of Helter Skelter thesis, which apparently was kind of the theory of the crime, the thesis of the motivation in the court case that led to the convictions. So so there is some question about how this is anybody going to pay enough attention to this new information that that apparently is relatively well documented, that's coming to light, that throws that throws suspicion on the sequence of events and the motivations and all of that. And will that have any, I don't think that anybody, even the guy who wrote this, wants people to get out, who are in, or, wants anybody to, to not have been convicted. And yet sort of like, it would be interesting if, if there were, if there were connections that were, I mean, the thing about conspiracy theories is that, I think the majority of them are just conspiracy theories, but, every once in a while, it's like, oh, wow. So.
Well, it's the key is, I can make a link from, Manson to MK Ultra.
Yeah.
Just to say, by saying there's a link.
Yeah.
But can I then, between those two, can I make smaller links with individual supporting facts that then actually shows the direct link between the two? And that's the problem with conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Well, and then I guess the big question at the other end of that is, so what?
I mean, I'm kind of surprised that for big seminal events in American history like that somebody hasn't gone in and scanned all of the court documents and supporting evidence and photos and all the stuff from the Manson story and put it online in an archive that the average Joe can go kind of thumb through bits and pieces of.
Apparently Los Angeles deliberately lost a lot of them. So, and the guy who wrote the book, what his name, Buccarelli or whatever his name was, apparently stole a bunch of them too.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
Vincent.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. Have a good week.
Have a good one. Thanks, Sam.
Take care.
Bye, Pat.